Right, it has been 47 days of planting, it's day 48 today, and 101 trees should have gone in that we're counting so far. There's another 6 that might be added to that later if they survive. There's a couple might be tweaked. So let's go and check on them. Okay, so first up we have our macadamia. That growth point looks a little more developed to me, but I'm not entirely sure. Overall, the plant looks healthy, so I'm happy for now. Our little eastern tree aloe is looking pretty nice and green. I think that might be a new leaf starting in the middle there. I hadn't noticed it before, so hopefully that's good. Generally speaking, nothing looks unhealthy, so I'm happy with that. Sables haven't really had time to settle in. The irises are standing up nicely, so they have rerouted nicely. The aloe is still a little bit distorted, but you can see it's starting to turn upright. Sabal itself, this fan is opening. That was already there when I got it, but I don't think it was starting to open yet. Number 2 is looking a little distorted, but I think that's more or less in keeping with how it was when I got it. Again, the iris seems healthy. Aloe, not really starting to turn yet. Our little Thespesia garciana, the tree hibiscus, you can see this lovely new growth. All this green is new since it came in. It lost one of its original leaves, but it's coming up with a lot more than it had, so I'm very pleased with that. The soursop continues its lovely, this is Annona muricata, continues its lovely little bit of onward growth. Very healthy looking generally. A little bit of insect damage towards this side. None of that is particularly fresh. Most of that seems to have happened in the early days of the planting when it would have been more stressed and vulnerable. The growth tips on our little bay laurel here, Laurus nobilis, are developing nicely. Our little pink mango, if we can get it to focus there, it's got some lovely new growth coming up, nice red growth. The backup seed was less healthy, I think, so the primary seed I put in does seem to be the only one visible currently, but it seems to be coming up quite well. Our Bauhinia pitesiana, the handkerchief tree, you can see the new growth is filling out a little. It's a little slow and looks a little fragile still, so it's not perfect, but it is starting to show up in a few more places along here, so that is very pleasing. The Aloe on our Washingtonia carries on flowering. I had been concerned because some of the mole rats were getting very close here that they might be interested in eating the stem, but it still seems pretty firmly in there. There's definitely been some activity close by. You can see a little digging up there, but they don't seem to have been too interested in this, so they might have had a nibble, but they don't seem to have done too much damage down there. It doesn't look too stressed. Doesn't look like it's doing much yet, but we'll see with time. Aloe Cameroni flowers on the 2 waterberries, looking very, very vigorous at the moment, which is nice. Down in here, you can see that growth on the first one to show any sort of positive response to replanting is coming up really nicely. All these leaves you can see here are new. These are the only old leaves down here visible, and this one. These 5 nice red tender leaves are new. There's no sign of anything similar on its neighbor here. And although this does seem to have picked up a bit, there's no real sign of any new growth there or on this one yet that I can see. So our lychees that went in the other evening. So the first one is looking nice and green, no sign of sunburn, generally speaking healthy. I was a little worried it might get sunburned here, but it has been getting afternoon sun in its pot, so this should be less stressful. It's also been raining torrentially for the last few days, so that should really help soak it in. This one, again, you can see the very pale new growth, which is very typical of what they were having in the pot. I'm not sure if it should be redder once they're settled in. It does seem to be redder on the larger plants, but that might be I'm not noticing the pale phase. You can see the growth tips are healthy and unsunburned, so I'm generally happy with that. And I'm also pretty happy with this little guy, who his tender growth is still not burned. There doesn't seem to have been any chicken activity up close, so hopefully the sort of proximity of the planting is serving him well. And yeah, it's a happy little jackfruit. And Rolf the Revolvia is starting to show some definite upward character. These branches that initially started to show regrowth initially were just going out to the side. There's still no sign of the sort of apical meristem heading up. You can see this is definitely tending more upwards than it has been previously. So we should be getting some more sort of tree-like growth coming in. And you can see some lovely growth on this little cashew tree here. And on this one, it's looking nice and healthy. Tiny little bit of new growth on this one, this little central bud coming up here. Some decent new growth and attended with some aphids there, which I might have to keep an eye on this one. This ant is Campanotus, one of the carpenter ants. Usually they're not too aggressive, but sometimes they can overwhelm a plant. And some new growth on this one, lovely and healthy. Cyagrus queen palm, Brazilian queen palm, not to be confused with the Carpentaria, which I thought it was for years. The central stem is still nice and healthy. The sides are still looking tragic. Once the central one starts opening up, or once the side ones go a bit browner, so they're not photosynthesizing anymore, I will cut them off so that this isn't sort of impeded by them. So our first two Brazilian queen palms, the Cyagrus romans-offiana, still looking pretty healthy, very standard for ones from pots. This is the perfect time of year for them because they love the inundation phase. They're not so keen on the drought phase. The second one, not much change from last week. This one is coming up, but not very fast. Okay, so our Dracaenas studinaria is showing no real signs of sunburn. There's a little bit of stress in the lower leaves there, which is probably just adapting. Some of its roots were damaged in the uprooting of the piece that had rooted where I'd left it lying waiting for planting. It's a little pale still. This does tend to be a paler species in the fragrance, so that might just be me worrying about nothing. But overall, it looks pretty healthy, and sunburn was what I was really worried about, and apart from a little of yellowing on the older leaves, there's nothing really indicating that, and it has had some sun. So, meanwhile, the Dracaena messangiana, which is just a variety of the Dracaena fragrance, is looking very sunburned around the kapok. There does seem to be a little bit of straightening happening on that one over there, and that one, because it's supported by that one and the kapok to a certain extent, isn't flopping so much. No new growth here on the kapok yet. There's definitely a bud coming, but not growing yet. And there's a slightly more strongly developed bud there. There's a tiny bit of damage that looks like it might be from the sun, but it's not even enough for me to think it is actually sunburn. But overall, it looks like a reasonably healthy plant still. So yesterday's little tiny Brachystegia taxifolia, looking quite nice and healthy. This leaf isn't actually quite as tiny as it sometimes is, so I'm wondering if this is actually a natural hybrid. This one also still no damage from chickens yet, so that's good. As yet unchickened. The Phoenix has been watered in nicely by last night's rain, looking just as it should. And both of the Cyagrus still upright despite the torrential rain. Well, as upright as they were, so this one had flopped right over where I found it, but the growing leaf was coming up and it's still oriented the way I wanted it to be, so we seem to be good on that. The sausage tree, the Cagelia africana, has some lovely new growth coming here in the center. Lovely news. Quite a few leaflets coming up there, so that should be quite a good stack of growth once it gets expanded. A little sunburn on the older leaves, but that's not going to go away. Hopefully the new leaves just won't be as sensitive. The frangipani over there, still rather flopped. There does seem to be a little bit more texture to those leaves, a bit too high for me to check on it, but I think that actually will take. The lychee is pretty good. I would say there's a little bit of crinkling up of the older leaves here. There definitely was some water stress when I went in. We didn't have as much rain as I expected the day they went in, which is probably why these are a bit stiff. But the new growth is healthy, there's no sunburn, and there's no sign of a meristem poking out just yet. The amla, which is probably, or emblic, or Philanthus emblica for maximum clarity, I guess, is just as the amla tends to do. It is taking everything in its stride. That does look like a growth point. The first one I planted didn't really grow the first season I put it in. It looked healthy, dropped all its leaves as it dried out, and then when the rains came back, just shot up. So I'm expecting this will do something similar, but maybe if the timing is right and these rains do seem more intense than last year's, maybe it'll feel a bit differently. The more sheltered of the lychee doesn't seem as water stressed. These leaves have much better texture than the first one. The new growth is healthy. I will have to take a couple of leaves off this aloe because it is going to get a little in the way there. I mean, if I don't, the tree will probably just bend around it, but just to give it the best chance. So there's nothing directly in its way and blowing around in the wind and knocking its meristems. So some lovely new growth on Wyatt's giant Schefflera, Heptaplerum actinophyllum. So I haven't killed it yet. Taking off a couple of the leaves that have been damaged by falling branches. That is one of the risks here, that a piece of bamboo will fall off onto it. Bamboo columns don't stand forever, but generally speaking the Schefflera are very good at regenerating if they do get knocked, so I'm hopeful that that won't be too much of a problem for it. The new leaf that had been coming on the smaller stem is now pretty much fully open. I'm curious to see how big they'll get in a more shaded environment. So Hamilton's sunburn seems to have actually got worse somehow, which isn't great. There isn't any visibility of new growth, but the meristem is alive. It's a little green dot just in the middle there. But I would definitely like a little more vigor and a little less sunburn here. Not thrilled with that. Aitken also seems to have finally suffered a little bit of what looks like sunburn. There's also some damage that doesn't look very old on some of these leaves. So these are the two Coliphosperma and Mopani, but there's... No, that's not a new growth. They're not thriving as much as I had hoped. But the more sheltered leaves over here are perfectly healthy. Clearly they weren't very well sun hardened where they were, but hopefully they should settle into here quite soon. So the rough lemon that have been growing really nicely, you can see a little citrus swallowtail on here has been nibbling away at some of those leaves. Usually these focus primarily on the older leaves, but clearly when they're young anything will do. There's actually quite a few here. Over the next few weeks these should be more or less devoured by parasitic wasps for the most part. A few will make it to adulthood, but most of the time they don't. We have a lot of the ichneumons around, so they won't be too much of a problem long term. They don't tend to eat the growing points, where there's more of a concern from aphids. The growing point itself, a little pale, but otherwise generally healthy. So I'm not too concerned, just a little sorry to see it not looking as vigorous as it did last week. Part of that's probably going to be the relative shortage of sun this week compared to last, so it shot up with a bit of light and then we've been mostly cloudy since. Enough to sunburn, but not really enough to do growth. But yeah, there's quite a few caterpillars here. So our lovely little tree philodendron, once again looking nice and vigorous. No particular damage, leaves generally healthy. Growth not too vigorous yet. I mean, I would personally love this to be about 6 feet tall by the end of the rains, but that isn't going to happen. Generally healthy. Peperamias again looking healthy and settled. Nice red stems, nice green points, nice red point on this one. And yeah, the little Sansevieras I put in there, pretty healthy too. So overall happy with that. A little tree tomato, filling out nicely. Not going to start using the term Tamarillo because I'm not a big believer in brand names. Yeah, it's a nice healthy little one. No real sunburn, a little bit of dieback on some of these older leaves, but that's to be expected. I'd say this so far seems to be suiting it quite well, this spot. So our tea tree remains a little pale. I do think there's some new pale growth on this, very soft and fragile. The base still seems healthy enough, as healthy as it was when it went in at least. And there's a little bit more new growth lower down than there was previously, so I'm not too concerned about the fact that it's not hardening up yet. Maybe as it dries out a bit, it'll get a bit firmer. And I just can't help but be filled with joy by the just vigor of this little moringa. I'm really pleased still with this. I'll be very upset when the dry season comes and it goes all deciduous. But for now, I really like that. So our little lychee here, the first one to go in. There's a little bit of mud on there. I thought that was sunburn for a moment, but no, it's just mud. It's been quite well splattered, but generally speaking healthy. A little less vigorous than I might have hoped for, but not unhealthy, so I'm okay with that. The Garcinia livingstone is still very much showing outward growth rather than upward growth. Not the worst problem. I do have another couple of other trees that tend to do this. They tend to spread out first, notably the Eugenia, very often will spread out for the first couple of years and then shoot upwards once it's settled in. But yeah, this is not bad, nice healthy growth, no real damage. Happy with that. Its sibling has progressed from the little bit of red lipstick through to actual growth phase, so that's pretty good. Also outward rather than upward. And the jackalberry that was looking so tragic a couple of weeks ago, you can see some lovely new growth coming all over here. Yeah, leaves opening up just about everywhere. So I'm pretty happy with that, and we've also got a couple of flowers sneaking up on these aloes. The texture on the leaves of this Eugenia is nice and waxy again. They're definitely filling back up. Those roots seem settled in quite well. This young growth here is healthy. This one, we're going to lose this tip. You can see it's died right back to the stem there. But it'll probably rebranch out from down here, or maybe a little lower down. So that's not too concerning, really. The bottlebrush tree, lovely tender new growth, a range of colours, very ornamental. I hope it's not unhealthy. The plant generally looks healthy, just this pale with these Australian trees worries me. Just instinctively I expect it to be redder like that, but it doesn't seem unhappy in any other way, so I'm hoping this isn't a problem. A little bit of mite, nope, just a little bit of insect piercing, but nothing major. Some new bits coming up too. Our Dombea, the wild pear, which I had been concerned isn't really showing much growth on this end. Still isn't really showing any growth on there. That seems like a new tip opening up just over here, so it's definitely focusing on the upward rather than the outward growth, in contrast to our little Garcinias. Our gay apple. Yeah, lovely new growth. Something has already had a nibble of that, but clearly didn't like it much. I'd say probably some sort of grasshopper, just testing, seeing if it was palatable and deciding it wasn't. But yeah, generally nice vigorous little plant. Nice vigorous little aloe flowers coming around it. That should be a shock of colour quite soon. And our non-native Bauhinia has these wonderful tender green leaves coming up. Almost look like a salad, they're so vigorous. Even the smallest of the ones that went in here has some nice new leaves on it. The medium one as well. Might have to sort of knit these together to make one tree. The other stand of Bauhinias is a little less vigorous. It didn't get as sunburned, but it's got some lovely new leaves on it. And still some of the older leaves which sort of detract from the fresh look. You can see down there. The others also have some nice new growth coming on them. This rough lemon still kind of stagnating, no sign of new growth. Doesn't look unhealthy. There's a little bit of insect damage, not covered in caterpillars where the other is. And the ants that we saw on it last week don't seem to be farming yet. So not sure why it's stagnating. It might just be settling its roots in. We'll keep an eye on it. This one does have ants on it, but no sign of aphids that I can see. No sign of caterpillars either. Nice healthy leaves. Might be some new growth, but I'm not convinced. I think it's just a generally perky looking plant, but it doesn't look like it's suffering visibly, just not doing much either at the moment. But it might just need a while to settle in. So the avocado, you can see just here, there is some new growth coming up. There's no real sign of sunburn. There's a few little stems poking up here. The original leaf that I left on, still pretty perky. I think this range really served these quite well. The leaves on the Kalango proliferate, which did come from a very shady spot actually, so that might be why, but they're feeling a little bit dehydrated and softer than they usually are. But it will take a little while for that to settle in and get used to this light, I guess. There's not really any sign of growth on the other one, the smaller one. The meristem is healthy enough. The leaf is a bit pale, but I feel like it probably was when I transplanted it. I can't actually remember. But generally speaking, nothing too concerning here. No real sign of damage, so if it is unhealthy, it's not unhealthy enough to start drawing everything in to consume it. And yeah, again, the growing tip is healthy, so when it decides to grow, it should come up fine. Our little lychee over here, perfectly perky. Leaves a good texture. Tiny suggestion of some growing points on these side branches here. Very, very small though, so No real activity, but a perfectly healthy little seedling otherwise. Meanwhile, our jackfruit has been knocked a little by the aloe deciding it's going to flop some more. But yeah, the growth point is healthy, it feels a good texture. So I'm happy with that. And the other lychee that went in with these is a growth point that has died back there, which is a shame, but this very tender growth often dies back. That's not usually a problem, because what happens is when the tip dies, you've got several of these little knobbly meristems along the side. There'll be an axial meristem will just come out in response to the lack of any sort of chemical deterrent from the tip. So we should get a slightly bushier plant on here, but it won't be really noticeable once it's a couple of years old. The rain may have washed out the ants that were farming here, and this Brachystegia that had been not the best, it's still not the most vigorous little seedling you've ever seen. It's a bit dark, but it is alive, and that's kind of good. The one that went in over here that had been suffering so close to the ants, I think that is done for, but both of these had damaged roots when they went in, so they're not on the count. They might end up added to it if they really thrive. Well, if this one thrives, the other one is past tense at this point. Trichilia emetica, the muscili, that growth point is just sitting there waiting to do anything at all. It hasn't yet done anything. But the leaves are healthy, they're a nice texture, they're a nice colour, no real damage. No, not really any insect activity yet, so should perk up eventually. And our most vigorous of the seedlings down in here. You can see that little tiny red point in the middle, if it will focus, on the growing tip, which is very pleasing, so we should get some growth coming up here very soon. On the other Brachystegia we counted, no real sign of any growth yet, not unhealthy in the middle there, just nothing coming out there, just staying tiny for now. Our unexpected fig is leafing up nicely and coming along quite well. It did have a lot of these larger leaves already visible last week, but it's still got some nice little growing points in the middle there, which is good. And our little yellow fruited mango. Some suggestion of a growth point in the middle of the tip there, but nothing major yet. But perfectly healthy. A little bit of stress on these young leaves here. Nothing to write home about. They're very good at dealing with that. Our second moringa still looking pretty reasonable. Definitely not as vigorous as the one in a more sheltered spot, which is something to bear in mind for future plantings. A little bit more shelter doesn't hurt. So about a couple meters further to the north, and it would have been just a little further out of the sun until it was established. But it's perfectly healthy, so I'm not too worried. And this does look like a little bit more growth on our little winter thorn, the Fadeherbia. Again, at this age, most of the growth is done in this season, so it does need to get some in before the rains end, because it's only once it's mature and has a good sort of water holding ability that it'll be doing its growth during the dry season in winter. But yeah, so there's some lovely bright green growing tips on most of these branches, so I'm happy with that. A little bit more from this Malina that had been looking quite sorry for itself last week, but you know, within the bounds of Malinas looking sorry for themselves, generally reasonable. Brydelia, the tip is absolutely dead, but there is definitely a healthy stem down here, so I think this will come back, but that won't, but this should. Malina number 2, which had very few leaves left on, perfectly perky. Brydelia number 2, very much in the same state as the first. This tip is just dead, but lower down there's a perfectly healthy stem, so I'm pretty hopeful this should start sending out shoots within the next couple weeks. So we'll see, hopefully by day 63, I guess, we should be getting some green poking out here, well, red to begin with. Our Malina that had been sulking last week has a definite growth point coming up and a couple more axillary buds coming up nicely. And our happiest Brydelia from last week still has a growing point on it. It hasn't really improved. It hasn't really gotten any worse. It's still alive. Still got some little axial buds waiting to come to life. Still got a tiny leaf. There's the direct tip, the youngest leaf, you can see crumbling off there, has actually died, but these 2 young leaves here haven't. So hopefully there'll be progress soon. Melina settling in, of course, because that's what they do. And our last Brydelia, very much the same as the first two. The tip is just completely dead, but the lower stem is looking pretty healthy and should be springing back. Yeah, by day 63, I'd be surprised if we don't have some growth on here. And our last Melina. The top is a little hard to get to with the scratches on this thing making the blurs visible, but you can see perfectly perky. Should fill out quite nicely soon. Onto our mixed planting day. Jacaranda number 1, again, nice vigorous growth, red and green. No real health problems there. Someone is living in there. Who is it? Something has been consuming leaves, but not really to the detriment of the plant. Little Spathodia campanulata. Nice and growth. This is the tulip tree from East Africa. Nice and vigorous. And somewhere inside this there is, there we go, our little Brachystegia garciana, which I was so worried we'd lost, and this is a whole new leaf, and you can see there's another one coming down there in the shadows. I will cut back some of this undergrowth that's coming up. Jacaranda number 2, nice new growth coming here, and that's definitely a Cameroni aloe. And Jacaranda number 3, of course, nice and healthy too. So it's good to see, mostly thriving. I have backfilled our little phoenix. I didn't want to do too much because I didn't want to bury the meristem. You can see this growth is still healthy. The older leaves are not. Whatever had been burrowing here seems to have given up and gone away, so that should reduce the root disturbance. So hopefully this will perk up quite soon. Our original Melinas barely need checking on at this point. They're so perky. I mean, this is fully settled in now. Got growth up and down the stem all over. Again, a nice vigorous piece here and here and again, and finally, yeah, all of those are very perky. I'm quite happy with that. Our little ghost tree, the original leaves now standing fully upright. That might have to do with the fact that it's been a very wet night and it's now cloudy, so it's not really had time to suffer any water stress yet. New growth in the middle there, looking nice and green, well, yellowy green. I'd like it a little redder. Again, most of ours tend to be red when new, but the leaves that came up first, nice and perky. They're not full size yet. I don't know if these are going to remain stunted or they're just on their way. This one's suffered a little bit of sunburn, I would say, but generally speaking, pretty healthy little plant. Pachira number 1 with some new growth, so that's good, as is the case with Pachira number 2, just here. Pachira number 3 is still a little bit slower than the other two, but this is definitely coming up. So on to our main line of Pachira, and the first set, we've got some lovely new growth in the middle there, and a generally very healthy plant with a nearly open aloe Cameroni flower. And a little bit more vigor here, number 2. Number 3, a little bit slower, but with some new growth coming up. Even so, just looking a little battered. I'm not sure whether it's just a bit more exposed here. Tamarind, nice and open with the rain. Got some good texture finally in the leaves of these jade bushes or speckboom, and the new growth on the sickliest of them is looking pretty nice and vigorous. So yeah, happy with that. Second round of Pachiras. This is Pachira glabra still. Nice healthy new growth. A little bit curled for my taste, but I think that's just something is living in there, so it should perk up once it's moved out. Slightly less vigorous new growth down here. I don't know if I can get that yet. Just there. And a nice little bit coming up here too. The third set, still stagnating a little bit. Bit more motion here. And a nice young leaf there. Again curled a bit. I'm not sure what this is. Usually they don't curl so stiffly. I'm not sure what's happening there. Might just be I'm not really accustomed to them out in more open environments. But generally healthy. I'm just curious as to why it's growing like that. Our little Pachira that could be Aquatica, the one that started in the bag, looks healthy, not really doing anything much at the moment. There is a growing tip there, and it's healthy enough, so I'm happy enough. Another healthy but curled new leaf on its neighbour, the Pachira glabra. And the same again on our very last Pachira glabra.
Okay, we have some nice vigor on this bamboo. Nothing really new to report there. Perfectly healthy. No new culms coming up yet. And our slightly more sheltered bamboo. So this is the Bambusa vulgaris. So we'll get much thicker once it's mature, but it's got some nice little new shoots coming out here. Even a couple slightly lower down. Still no sign of culms, but again, I wouldn't usually expect that within the first year of planting, so quite happy with that. Yeah, so overall, I'm going to keep an eye on a couple of things, but I don't think there's anything I'm actually particularly worried about this week. There's the one sort of beyond the count Brachystegia spiciformis, which is not healthy at all and, you know, almost certainly dead, but it's in with another one that also had root damage and wasn't counted, that is looking much healthier than it was to me. So overall, I will be keeping an eye on things like that Pachira glabra not growing in the way I usually expect, but I do think a large part of that is these are in more exposed, more windy locations, so to conserve water they're probably folding up as they come up so they're not losing too much. But generally speaking, yeah, I'm very happy with everything.